Armstrong Wolfe's podcast, a series looking into the world of conduct, culture, values, purpose, and the wonderful world and ambiguous world of human behaviour. In that context, I'm delighted today to be speaking to arguably one of the global leaders within this space, Stephen Scott. Stephen is founder and CEO of Starling, a globally recognised pioneer in the reg tech space. Starling's predictive behavioural analytics platform allows firms to measure and mitigate culture and conduct related risks and to identify opportunities for performance improvements across business lines and functions. Stephen has a wonderfully colourful career and spent 25 years career in risk management and corporate intelligence, serving clients when they were either entering new markets, ventures or commercial relationships, conducting pre-investment due diligence or testing an investment thesis, carrying out investigations into fraud and corruption, pursuing redress through a litigation, arbitration or government inquiry, and when seeking to advance their interests before government and regulatory agencies. He has led successful investigative inquiries in over 50 countries and indeed speaks 3 languages fluently, and would also claim that he can get by in Mandarin and order himself a beer or 2, and has lived and worked in New York, Washington, London, Frankfurt, Madrid and Shanghai. Stephen holds degrees from Cornell University, the London School of Economics, the Columbia Graduate School of Business and the London Business School. I personally was introduced to Stephen a couple of years ago on my own journey, investigative journey, trying to understand the nuances of conduct, integrity, behaviour and misconduct. And since then, we've grown to understand each other. And that is why today, rather than looking at the end of the journey, or maybe the next stage of his journey rather, which is where he was with Starling Trust, I'm more interested in the man himself and what took him on this route journey and what has shaped his thoughts and therefore by definition shaped the capability that his firm now offers the markets. So Stephen, welcome and thank you very much indeed for taking your time to speak to me today. And I'm just going to start off, Stephen, with bringing you into the conversation. I just talked about such an enriched academic and professional career and having lived in so many countries. Is there a point in your journey, do you consciously turn your attention to understanding human behaviour, or was there a trigger or was a series of triggers that sparked your interest that actually started this journey?
Well, Maurice, thanks very much for that. Thanks for having me, and thank you for your own leadership in our space. Yeah, I've been asked this question before, and yeah, I'm the oldest of 9 children, and so I kind of feel like I was born into a group dynamic that one needed to get one's arms around. So I've been interested in what makes us tick for as long as I can recall. I started university, in fact, at a community college. So it's a 2-year school here in the US where my father was a professor, and I was studying business because I had it in my head that if you studied business, you could make money. And what I actually fell in love with was psychology and sociology. And so you referenced my time at Cornell. I pursued those studies there. And dived into philosophy. It's really hard to talk about the way individuals think about themselves or groups perceive themselves without understanding belief systems and philosophical predispositions. So I had a very, very clear academic orientation in that direction. And so I think what really shifted over the years is maybe the unit of analysis. So I went from thinking about the individual, which is psychology, to the group, which is sociology, international relations, which was my master's at the London School of Economics. And then you mentioned my business school degree. So again, you're looking at market participants. And in all of those instances, you're looking at how people engage with themselves and one another and look for rules of engagement, look for patterns of behavior. And I got interested in that. And in the course of my investigative career, I got pretty good at that. And that sort of taught me that the human organism is a pretty consistent one. And regardless of where I was in the world and regardless of our rich cultural heritages and all the wonderful distinctions that imparts, the human being as an organism is very, very highly consistent, right? You never want to go to the doctor and have them say, gee, I've never seen that before, right? So if we're consistent, then that means behavior occurs in patterns. And if those patterns are identifiable, then we can anticipate future behavior to some degree within bounds of confidence. And so I started asking myself several years ago, how could I marry up this weird skill set that I've developed to all the big data and AI stuff that the kids are talking about in Silicon Valley. And I've stated this before, be completely transparent. I could not spell AI when I started Starling, but it just seemed to me that it couldn't be that terribly hard. There's so many wonderful tools that are already in the market. If we could grab some of those ideas and technologies and pair them up with my domain expertise, we could do something special and different in the world. And that's what led to the creation of the business.
So that's I agree with you with technology or technologies, the art of the possible. I may know the art of the possible, but that is the limit of my understanding of actually how technology works, to be honest with you. But it's interesting that you saw the emerging technologies and how there was an opportunity to marry your deep-rooted interests. And actually, I really like the way that you determined the sort of from the individual through society through to international relations. You could argue this is a highly opportune time to actually appropriate time to be talking loud for what's going on in the Ukraine, two different societies, the frailties of humankind, the individual. So I like the idea of actually how it's sort of a stepping stone, from the individual to society, then to international, and then actually how you sort of wrap that around. So actually, how do I marry that to technology? Now, on that journey, when you got to that point, you would have actually got to that point, presumably, where you would already look back down your career and you could see many different companies that you've helped when they've suffered when down onto the frailties of human behavior. You have cases involving fraud or corruption or misuse of power and position. If you look back, when you were looking back, were there any commonalities that you observed to the failings of organizations and companies that have been exposed to unlawful behavior? And on the flip side, did you identify any leadership traits or organizational traits which would suggest that those organizations were less likely to fall foul to poor behavior and conduct and malpractice?
So a couple of different things to unpack there. So in terms of commonalities, there were a few that really stood out. I spent, as you referenced, decades looking at things gone wrong, people doing things they ought not to have done and causing harm for others. One can get pretty pessimistic about the human animal in the course of that kind of career. What I found is that I do believe people are fundamentally good. And that includes just about everyone that I was sitting across the table from who had been involved in doing something wrong. I had men and women in tears looking at me and saying, I just don't want to be involved. And I said, I completely understand that. I wouldn't want to be involved either. But the fact that I'm sitting here and you're sitting there means you're involved. So help me understand what happened here. You seem like a decent person, and I think your mama raised you right, and you recognize that what you did was wrong. You're cognizant of the fact that it was in fact illegal, and you don't seem like the sort of person to do something like this, but yet it's happened. Can you help me understand that? And in every case, in every country, in every culture, the answer was the same, and the answer was, I had no choice. Now that argument didn't fly at Nuremberg. But I think there is something important in that is often overlooked in the way we approach non-financial risk in the banking sector, certainly, but every other industry. We like to believe that human beings are rational creatures, right? Homo economicus is the caricature, and that we weigh and deliberate our action choices very carefully before we take steps. But behavioral science shows that that's largely not the case. Daniel Kahneman, I believe is a Nobel laureate, wrote a book on thinking fast and slow, which is pretty popular, and he talks about how we think quickly according to heuristics and cognitive shortcuts the vast majority of the time. And yet all of our management science is predicated on the idea that human beings are operating on what he calls system 2, this slow deliberative process, and it's simply not the case. So that is a consistent pattern that I noticed everywhere. So people are genuinely good. I mean, look, there are some people who are pretty evil. I think the statistics hold it as around 4% of the population is sociopathic. And so, you have guys like Bernie Madoff, who was clearly a sociopath. But the vast majority of people who get caught up in scandalous affairs, corruption, etc., they're just decent people trying to do the best they know how to do, and their behavior is shaped largely unconsciously by the expectations of those around them. And so if you can start diving into that, you can start to get to root causes of organizational behavior.
Yeah, and I think there's I always think back to some of the very simple lessons I was taught at the Royal Military Academy standards around that we were taught the overriding influence on a soldier's behavior is the behavior of the person that leads them. And yeah, and actually, if you think, and most of the junior soldiers, they would follow their leader because they didn't have a broad perspective on world life by the time they joined the army, and they didn't know what was right or wrong, but they just presumed what they were being told was right. So that's why I can see what you're saying there. There's no malice or forethought. There's no guilt in the decision, but they've just been, and they didn't find that they'd done wrong until they're retrospectively looking back on it. I can see actually that how that journey can unfold. But I think, yeah, go on.
No, just let me just challenge you on that a little bit, given your own military background. What if the commanding officer has been killed? Right. One of the things that I remember studying when I was studying international relations was the landing at Normandy, when your lot and our lot hit the beaches and were decimated. And the orders went out to take out the German commanders. And when the German soldiers were left without someone issuing orders, they had a hard time managing that. Whereas the Yanks and the Brits were pretty good at figuring things out on our own. So I think it's more the relationship of the person alongside you rather than above you that carries the day.
It's actually interesting because it's the systematic process of leadership in the British and the British and the American Army that allowed you to do that. And what I mean by that is that you are trained to operate one up, and you're trained to operate one up because of the possibilities of casualties in war.
Yeah.
And therefore, there's the expectation that your leader will be taken out. But also, it's also tied to mission-oriented orders or leaders' intent, the empowerment of the individual to operate make decisions within their own parameters and own boundaries of exploitation, as long as it's tied to leaders' intent. Ironically, a lot of people think about the military as the pyramid the other way, in relation to rather than empowerment bottom up, they actually see it as jump, how high should I jump?
Right.
Yeah, and I think that's that. Whereas the German German hierarchical process was different, and it's a good point to think about how the Brits and the Brits and Americans think more differently than the Germans, because that was exactly what the premise in which Churchill built the British Secret Service. He collected the most intelligent, obscure people in Whitehall. And he said, I want you to come up in the most peculiar ways how we can trick the Germans because we think differently from them. And there's a book you should read called Operation Mincemeat. I suggest that you capture it. And one of the individuals within that cell was, of the intelligence cell, was Fleming, as in James Bond.
That's
so
right.
All of these outrageous ideas he's got, a lot of them were by drinking whiskey and smoking cigarettes in the Second World War under Whitehall, paid to come up with the most ludicrous ideas of actually how to trick the enemy. So anyway, there's a podcast off piece, I think we could say.
There we go. Well, I'm a fan of any training regimen that involves smoking cigars and drinking whiskey. So
dragging things back to some form of normality and back to your own journey. You were talking about the sort of the frailties of human spirit. You're talking about how Daniel Kahneman actually viewed humankind in relation to different types of system, whether it's slow thinking or automatic quick thinking, or, as I don't use the right terminology there. My immediate thought by them, by the way, was thinking about, if you think about the frailties of banking and trading environment, they have to make decisions very quickly by instinct a lot of the time. And so actually it's interesting how you could dovetail what, say, Daniel's thoughts are into actually what the requirements of bankers have to do in different parts of a bank. Some indeed have time to think about, slow management time, like in operations and compliance, etc. But those that are making money, their very nature is actually they're relying on their ability to make intuitive, fast decisions. Which you could say that's where there's some decisions can be made by error and not by intent in that context.
That's right.
That was very sort of a weak attempt to actually drive a path to banking, by the way, which I think I managed to do on that. Now, one of the interests I've had on my own journey in relation to technology and the use of technology within the world of conduct, first line controls, has been like the emergence of surveillance technology. And when I look at like the last 6 or 7 years, the tsunami of different companies coming up with different surveillance capabilities for banks. Some banks then investing hugely in relation to their self-built technologies, and then some banks buying an off-the-shelf product. But fundamentally acted as a sort of a deterrent. And actually, if you speak to most banks, marginal and notional detection, more of a deterrent. But actually, it was seen as a must-to-have, and almost like the holy grail. It was seen as they're taking the box to go to the regulators. We're doing what we can. We've got the most up-to-date surveillance. Even like the mechanics. I can remember the mechanics of the lexicons coming in, and it was like this big. That we're on the journey to salvation because we've got lexicons. We've got technology can actually recognise that lexicon. I remember thinking at the time that actually the most dangerous combination you could have is you're 4% of an evil person and someone with a top 4% of an intellect, because they would be able to navigate their way through any form of surveillance, any form of in context to that. And I've always thought that it was almost like the surveillance technology was like the finger in the dam, in the dike, as opposed to actually the need to actually got to think of something fundamental. We're going to build a new dike or a new reinforcement to the dike. And that's when when I was introduced to you, I was always sort of thinking that could be where we're going, where we should be going. So what I wanted to do is talk about is, so I've just got a question here that I scribed earlier on. Within banking, there's been further investment in surveillance technology, which I've just talked about, that is aimed at detection and by its very presence, deterrent. Yet here again, there seems to have only been successful in part. In your present capacity, running Starling, you have embraced technologies and have married them to your deep-rooting understanding and interest in the human spirit, which we've actually already talked about. How would you differentiate, just for those listening to this now, how would you differentiate the pathway to risk mitigation that you have developed against what many see as the only option at this moment, which is surveillance technology?
Well, that last point is an important one. There is the perception that surveillance is the best that we can do. Look, I think if you hosted a party and you invited everyone that was passionately in love with surveillance and monitoring, you'd have the punch bowl largely to yourself, and maybe a couple of the salespeople with different surveillance and monitoring companies. Nobody likes it. It's got, in the West, it's got a big brother connotation. To the points that you raised earlier, it's not terribly effective. 90+% false positive rates, and you get a false positive signal that something's gone awry, and now you have to send people in to examine that, which is terribly costly. And 90% of the time, they're going down in a dry hole. I think of the people who have that job in banking and what a miserable existence it must be, because you spend most of your time chasing ghosts. And so, and yet the spend on it is astronomical.
Yeah.
I think I've read, I believe it was Bain that came out with a report some years ago saying that it was 15 to 20% of the run the bank cost base is devoted to this sort of stuff. So where's the ROI? If you look at the industry in the last decade, the banking sector in the global aggregate has paid out approaching $800 billion in punitive fines and customer remediation, and during a time when they spent at least as much on their risk governance infrastructure. So, as a world, we've thrown $1.5 trillion at this problem in the last decade, and I don't think that we've moved the needle very much. So I didn't want to do a better job of what's being done. I wanted to do something else. And it seems to me that in banking, the mentality that supports surveillance and monitoring, there's that deterrent element, to be sure. But for the most part, those tools operate to detect bad acts and bad actors after the fact. And yeah. I've termed that a detect and correct approach to managing these risks. But in a number of other industries, I think nuclear power, pharma, military, we talked about, aviation, we don't want something that detects a nuclear meltdown and sends in the cleanup crew. We want to have a system that predicts and prevents nuclear meltdowns, because that's just untenable. I don't want you to tell me that if there's a problem with the plane, you'll know it because it takes a nosedive, into the Pacific Ocean. I want to know in advance that the plane is probably not safe to be put up in the air. And I don't know why in the banking sector, which represents 20% of GDP in most economies, I don't know why we accept a lower standard of care. And particularly when we can do better, cheaper, and ameliorate huge reputational risk. And now in the UK with the senior managers regime, that represents personal liability exposure. So we've set out to pioneer something entirely new and different and better.
So I think listening to you then, I suppose in some ways, if you look at the air industry, look at the army, obviously that you've got the outcome of failure is human frailty, death, injury. But actually, you could argue if people actually understood the outcome of failure of 2008 was impact on society, depression, suicides, etc. So if you actually look at the impact, it's still exactly the same.
I'd say it's even grander, and I'm glad you brought that out. And I get pretty passionate about this, so forgive me for getting up on a soapbox. But I think that you can draw a direct line between 2008 and January 6th last year on Capitol Hill. I think that the average man on the street sees a system that's rigged, where the people who have money live by one set of rules and the rest of us live by some other set of rules. And history shows that people won't tolerate that for very long. And so when the banking system suffers failures of the sort that we've seen in the last decade, and it leads people to question and lose trust in the industry, along with that goes a certain element of faith in capitalism. And if the government isn't taking adequate corrective action, you lose faith in democracy. I think a majority of youngsters today, youngsters, I mean 20-ish and under, they really don't value democracy terribly highly. It's an option. So you go back to those poor boys who gave their lives on the beaches of Normandy to fight for democracy, only to find that their grandchildren and great grandchildren really don't give too much of a fuss about it.
There's many different arguments to come. This will be the next podcast, because this is a very interesting, because I actually do believe that if you put actually how many people are actually impacted, how many deaths were related to the 2008, it's going to be a multiple on those actually amount of people who actually died in their crash.
Absolutely.
So then if we then look into the biggest challenge for adoption of your technologies. Now I have views on this that I can bring in, but I'm really interested to get your view on when you're walking through the door with a product that you absolutely know works, because you know it from all the different nuances, the way that you've how your experiences come together. You've tested it. You've got the patronage, if I look at your advisory team, of some of those leading bankers over the last 10 years. They wouldn't attach their name to your product if they weren't advocates of it. We then talked about, and then the banking industry has a wonderful track record of spending upwards to say something around 20% involved within control mechanisms, surveillance mechanisms. But what's the biggest impediment or challenge that you have in relation to the markets adopting the technologies that are now exist, like Starling's?
Yeah, I appreciate that question. I don't think that it's anything special. Any new technology follows a fairly well understood adoption curve. People don't like change very much, and we've got a way of doing things. The regulators accept that we've got our deterrent surveillance and monitoring system. They're not insisting that we use something newfangled like the products that Starling and some others are bringing to market. So, until we're told that we must do differently, let's just carry on. And so I think the biggest problem is inertia. Another challenge, and I know this is true for many of my colleagues and peers at other reg tech firms that operate well outside of the domain that we operate in, but still within the reg tech space, is that it's not very clear who owns some of these problems within the financial institution. right? If you walk in and you say, well, we've got a culture issue. Well, okay, then you're sent to HR. So, but it's a culture issue that leads to misconduct. Well, if it's potential misconduct, then you're sent to compliance or perhaps risk. If it's past misconduct that's landed you in hot water, maybe you're sent to see the general counsel. And everyone sort of points in different directions. When you ask, well, who has the budget to actually implement something new? Everyone points to the first line and says, well, we're really trying to embed this in the first line. Risk management is everyone's responsibility. And of course, we know from psychology and sociology that if it's everyone's responsibility, it's no one's responsibility. And so until I think the senior managers regime seeks to get to this, until we identify people who are specifically held accountable for the actions of the organization, and until regulators and prosecutors know how to ask the different kinds of questions that get to root causes, such as those we've discussed in this conversation, I think we'll waffle on as we're doing for a while. That's fine. I mean, that's the nature of innovation. But there will be leaders who say, you know what? I want to be seen by my regulator to be the firm that pushed the envelope on this. There's something new out there in the world. I don't know if it works. I don't really even care all that much. It's a very minimal bet to trial it. And I'll probably get kudos for just trying to push the envelope. And so some people will see that in their own enlightened self-interest.
So yeah, I think, but one of the things you brought in there, and you talk about the responsibility of the first line. Perhaps we can follow this up in the follow-on conversation, but I think the 3 lines of defense model, from in relation to you thinking about the advancements and capabilities of technologies, that's one of the impediments to embracing this, because I think you'd say about the first line, you own the risk, but actually the first line have minimum appetite for revenue or capital expenditure for anything isn't basically a person making money or technology tool that is making money. So they question the capital that's got to be invested in franchise protection, because they really see that as a second line responsibility. But actually your product, if you think about it, which is more predictive, is about outward and forward looking, as opposed to surveillance and what compliance does and what second line does, and even what a lot of first line controls have been. They've been inward and backward looking. How do we stop the past recurring again, as opposed to actually looking how banking and technologies have moved on, of actually how can you actually preempt something, the emerging risk, horizon scanning, how can you there throw into that the understanding of human behavior, so you can anticipate or identify, anticipate and stop before action. And I think the problem being is actually they're saying, well, I can say, well, this technology, well, and it could be just as simple as, well, it's like a form of surveillance, isn't it? So therefore we'll stick it, that's compliance. Get compliance to have a look at it. And compliance going, well, yeah, no, we're quite happy with what we've got, our check and balances stuff with surveillance. So we've got this, and what we've got 500 ex-traders who are going through emails to make sure that they can, oh, well, great. So I think the 3 lines of defense model in itself, and actually how, yes, the first line owns risk, and yes, SMR, I think SMR is probably the simplest, most impactful regulation that we've had in many ways in this space. But actually, I think there's also a cultural nuance in relation. You've got to get everyone to understand that everyone owns the risk to a degree. And I think that would actually then help. So I don't know, those just are my thoughts on some of the addition. I think it is inevitable. There will be someone eventually, and it will be when they have a case study of success in relation to, we invested in X, and this is what we can say that it's done from us from a commercial perspective. And then everyone go, oh, come on, lemmings, let's go.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting you say that. So we did a big project I'm allowed to speak about with HSBC a couple of years ago. And the chap for whom we were working was the global head of operational risk, who has since left HSBC and has joined Starling. And that work was looking at the 3 lines of defense and dysfunctionality across the 3 lines of defense, and how you could anticipate that and take corrective measures in advance of mishap. And Harvard Business School actually wrote a case study about the work that we did there. And I can tell you that when HSBC was talking to the U.S. regulators, they showed real interest in the fact that HSBC was trialing a new approach to this. That's not hooray for Starling. It could have been someone else that they trialed. But I think the regulators are awake to the fact that there's a new category of technology in the world. And if there's a better way of skinning the cat, then maybe we want to see firms experimenting with that.
Well, I think picking up on that then as well, Stephen, that I think building the commercial case for the use of these technologies, and what I enjoy about our conversations is that you infrequently, as opposed to frequently, talk about Starling. You frequently talk about the concept of technologies, of how they can actually service the industry to a positive end. I think if we look at, say, building the commercial case for adoption of technologies, I was going to ask this in this podcast, but I think probably what I'm going to do is shift that into the next podcast, because I think what it's going to drag away the conversation, which I want to drag back to, which is you as an individual, and then we can use that as a springboard of saying, and now I've landed at Starling and this is where we are, and how do you build the commercial case for the use of these technologies? So there's just two other areas I wanted to talk about, and that was, you've lived in multiple countries, you've worked in multiple jurisdictions, you've worked for clients and on cases within over 50 countries, or 50 years. No, he's only 35, ladies and gentlemen. And I just wonder whether, if your experiences and understanding of human behaviour, what's your understanding of multiple different regional cultures, and how do you think that this manifests itself in a different adoption and different challenges in relation to the subject that we're talking around?
Yeah, we get this question a lot. It's a hard one to talk about because it just sort of makes intuitive sense for people that, the Japanese are different than the Peruvians. And so you expect different behaviors in those different cultural contexts. And to some degree, that's true. A metaphor I like to use is, if you think about genes, right? I mean, human beings all have roughly the same genetic code. But the way that's expressed is different in different people, to include twins. So I think there's the expression of cultural predilection, which is what most people tend to focus on. But then there's this underlying genetic code. There's a basic biological system that you can learn about through a study of the natural sciences. We are a fundamentally social species. I do a lot of public speaking on this, and I'll ask people, so imagine, if you have children, imagine they don't exist. Not that they've died, just that they don't exist, that they never existed. You have a wife, imagine she doesn't exist. Parents, siblings, friends, colleagues, imagine none of them exist. Now tell me about yourself. And you're left speechless. I'm some blob that's moving through this, empty space that's defined by its meaninglessness, right? So we are profoundly social, and we must be. We would not have succeeded as a species to the extent that we have if we were not able to collaborate with strangers at scale as a presumed behavioral norm. And we are hardwired for that. And so if you buy that argument, and I think you'd be foolish if you didn't, then you ask the question, well, if belongingness is an evolutionary imperative, how do we maintain it? And the answer is, when in Rome, right? The answer is, the term in sociology is normative compliance. You behave as your peers expect you to behave if you wish to remain a member of this group. Hence, when I ask good people why they did bad things, they say, I had no choice. It was either do this or risk ostracism, ridicule, rejection. And that's just simply an intolerable set of experiences for this organism.
If you then think you go back to mankind's history, which is, as we all know, this is a microcosm on the world's history when you look at the graph. And then you can see, therefore, if you extend that, maybe I'm looking into this slightly wrong, but when you're captured within when we were in different tribes, and actually you basically adopted to what that culture of that tribe was, because that's how you survived. You could not, over time we segregated, but actually, even though, and you could actually argue now that in relation to nations are like tribes. So and that defines that culture. It doesn't make it necessary. And there's still going to be people who are doing things within a nation where they fundamentally probably think that's not right to do, but I'm doing it because that's what we all do. And I suppose actually that could take us on down the road of actually the importance of culture and purpose in an organization. Technology is one of the principal tools, and certainly this sort of technology could be an evolutionary tool but it is one of the jigsaw that actually makes success for a business. And I've been doing a lot of work recently. I'm very interested in the whole concept of purpose and how that differentiates from what a lot of people see as purpose and values, etc. But I think, and actually, so that's what I was going to just bridge into the last question. So we've looked at all your interest and your journey to the point now in relation to marrying technology and your interest in human behavior and analytics and how you can then be predictive, and then you can turn the tension forward and outward and be on an anticipatory footing as opposed to reactionary. So what do you feel, therefore, that if we then go from the quantitative application of technology to the qualitative components of leadership, what role does leadership have within addressing this embedded challenge which has not been resolved? And I'm just wondering whether your thoughts on actually how you marry leadership to, apart from which we both agree it's going to take a leader to take that jump of faith in the technologies to say, well, actually, I'm going to be first. But what's the role that you see in leadership as a key component part of this journey?
Well, so I guess we first have to define what leadership is, and what a leader is. And I think that, certainly in most Western cultures, when you think about leadership, you think about whoever sits at the big desk, and then there's this hierarchical structure beneath. There's a wonderful social scientist at Carnegie Mellon University called David Krakauer, who wrote a terrific piece in the Harvard Business Review that I recommend to you. It's called "The Company Behind the Chart" or something of that sort. And what he says is that, the hierarchy, right, the org chart of any organization is a bit like the London Tube map, right? I mean, the London Tube map does not at all reflect the way the lines actually run. If you tried to steer according to the London Tube map, you drive into a wall, right? But so if we think that tube map represents reality rather than a shortcut navigation tool, then we're profoundly wrong. And I think most management science falls prey to that fallacy. They believe that the leaders that they think are leaders are in fact leading. I had a conversation with my young daughter not too long ago, and we're talking about friends of hers in school, and who was a leader and who was a follower. And I asked her, well, what are you? What do you see yourself as? She goes, oh, I'm a leader, Dad. And I said, that's great. How many followers do you have? And she said, I said, listen, if no one's following you, you're not leading. It's that simple. Leadership is not about a title or filling a box on an org chart. And so the leaders of an organization are very often not the people who are identified as such. Right? It goes back to our boys and yours on the beaches of Normandy, right? If you understand commander's intent, then you can lead one another in a desired direction. And if you don't have an ability to peer into that as it's occurring in vivo in an organization, then you're really managing largely by assumption and guesswork, which most often proves to be wrong.
So actually, if I'm going to bridge back into my time at the Royal Military Academy, and fellowship is what that we're taught. And when I passed off the square at Sandhurst, went to my father. My father was in the army, grandfather and great grandfather. And I said, so Dad, can you give me the best lesson you can on how to be a good leader? And he said, it's very simple, son. He said, as an officer in the army, you've got to remember their salute the rank and their fight for the man.
That's it.
And I think we think about corporate life. I even think about the pyramidal growth of, well, that means an extra 4 or 5 square feet from my office. Well, that means an extra window. Yeah, and I think that it's missing the point of leadership, isn't it?
It's a fundamental misapprehension of what leadership is, which is in turn based on a fundamental misapprehension of how this organism functions. And so the basis of management science, and look, I'm steeped in it. I have 2 MBAs for the bargain price of 3. the basic understandings and assumptions under most management science, I think, is just debunked. It's wrong, and so we're going to need a whole new generation of leaders to come up and think about this stuff differently. And that's I think we're in the process of that currently.
Well, I think that, Stephen, I'm absolutely delighted that you spent time with me today, and I really hope that those listening will actually be inspired and enthralled, just as I have and I continue to be. I also hope that only having one degree from Cardiff University myself is that I can inspire individuals that they may be able to hold a conversation in 40 minutes with a man as academically achieved as you. And so if nothing comes out of this, but the Cardiff graduates somewhere has got a spark of hope, then we've achieved something. I want to really follow on this. We will, with podcasts, I think there's two coming out of this to me. There will be one about building the commercial case for further technology investment and taking that leap of faith in new technologies and behavioral analytics. And I think the other, is taking you away from your technologies and then further investigating humankind, human behavior, and then leadership. And I think that whilst that they are bedfellows, I think what I'd like to do is take the path on too, if you're happy to do that.
Very much so. Sure.
Thank you very much indeed for your time. It's been an absolute privilege to speak to you, Stephen. God bless you.
Thank you, Maurice. Thanks for having me. Back at you.